a preeminent behind-the-scenes statesman, Richard Haass, who is president of the Council on Foreign Relations and author of a recently published A World in Disarray, American Foreign Policy and the Crisis of the Old Order. Richard's going to provide us an update of the state of the world and the complexities of foreign relations in these challenging times. Welcome.
Well, good afternoon. I feel you've all given me something of a moving target to talk about the state of the world. It's changed since 9 o'clock this morning. I kind of feel we should have like a Twitter feed on the screen while we do this, because no doubt it will change again between now and 2 o'clock. What I'll try to do, though, is, and what I know I will succeed at doing, by the way, I will depress you. And if the organizers have a heart, we'll go straight from here to the bar. But what I thought I'd do is give you some sense of where we are, but I'll begin with a little bit how we got here, and then maybe a few things about going forward so it doesn't seem all hopeless. But just the setting, think about it. Here we are, roughly 25 years, roughly a quarter century since the end of the Cold War. And just as an aside, for those of you of a certain generation, in about 3 weeks we'll mark the 50th anniversary of the Six-Day War. So history marches on. Time marches on. It's a conversation for another day of what, why did the Cold War end, when it ended, how it ended, and all that. I only mention it for one reason, which is as hard as it is to predict the future, it's not much easier to explain the past. Even hindsight isn't necessarily 20/20. And I think the end of the Cold War is a good example of that. What's clear, though, is the post-Cold War world is an awful lot messier than the Cold War world. And I think there's lots of reasons why, and this is relevant. One is simply we lost the discipline of the Cold War. There were all sorts of formal and informal rules that regulated US and Soviet competition, but even more relevant is the fact that that was a world essentially of concentrated power. And there were two camps, whatever you want to call it, two poles in the world. And now this is a world that could not be more different. This is a world of diffused or distributed power. And instead of decision-making largely residing in two places, decision-making is similarly distributed. There's many more players in the world, not all of whom are states. I expect a lot of, many of you represent entities with significant capacity and power. But again, it ranges from the benign to the anything but. You've had the diffusion of technology, which has both been a cause of it and a reflection. And then you've also had globalization. And I think, well, while it's not totally new, but what's new, I think, is the scope of the flows that cross borders, the range of things that is crossing borders, the speed. So you've got quantity and quality and great velocity. And I think the reality is that we now live in a world where nothing stays local for long. That just about everyone and everything, one way or another, can get on the highway that is globalization. And what has grown up is a significant gap between the scale of these global flows and the ability of the world to regulate them and to contend with them. And this global gap, I would think, is one of the defining realities of the 21st century. And the risk of getting ahead of ourselves, I think one of the real interesting questions of history is whether the gap between globalization and the ability of governments and others to contend with globalization, whether that gap grows or shrinks. And probably as much of anything as anything else, the answer to that question will tell you an awful lot about the character of the 21st century. But I don't want to give you the sense that we are where we are, this world that where, if you will, centrifugal forces are quite powerful, inevitably. I also think that we got here in part because of the behavior of governments, and above all, the United States. And I would simply say that the United States has contributed to this post-Cold War world, what I call a world in disarray, both by acts of commission and omission. Principal acts of commission being things like the Iraq War, 2003, the decision to go into Libya, but then also lots of acts of omission. The decision not to get involved meaningfully in Syria, not to follow up the Libya intervention. More recently, the decision to take the United States out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And I say this not to pick on various administrations, though I'm not above doing that, but more to say that there's very little about history that's inevitable. That even though there were structural forces that came into play with the end of the Cold War, I don't think it was inevitable that we'd end up where we've ended up in 2017. It took decisions and actions by the United States and others to get us to this point. Unless that depresses you, it's also an optimistic point, because it also says that there's very little about the future that is in cement. And even though we have globalization and we have the world that we have, going forward, what the United States and other governments choose to do and how they choose to do it and what it is they choose not to do will again have significant event going forward in terms of the character of this world. What's the balance between forces of order and disorder, or what a famous academic called the forces of society and the forces of anarchy? And I don't know the answer to that, but again, there's very little about it that is preordained or predictable. I would say, though, that on the negative side of the scales is the fact that the current American administration has arguably added to it to some extent. And I think that Mr. Trump's bias towards disruption and his pattern of unpredictability has added to the centrifugal forces at play in the world. He sees it as warranted, given his view of what he inherited. He sees a plus in keeping others uncertain about what it is that the United States might do. I think the negatives outweigh the pluses, happy to discuss it. But the fact is, as someone once pointed out in another context, we are where we are, where we are. So what does this mean? What sort of more specific challenges do we face going around the world? Regionally, let's just go quickly around the world regionally. I think in the Middle East, the analogy that comes to mind is the 30 Years' War. Like I said, I told you I would depress you. For those of you who were not around at the time in early 17th century Europe, this was a political, religious struggle that waged within and across borders for 3 decades. And even though history doesn't repeat itself, as Mark Twain once said, it rhymes, there's some rhyming there. And I think what we are seeing are political, religious struggles within and across borders and multiple fault lines. Shia, Sunni, Iran, Saudi, we see Israeli, Palestinian, Israeli, Arab, many others as well. And this is, I think, still in its early days. There's no shortage of fuel for this fire, and the consequences of this are great. The Middle East matters. As I said, nothing stays local for long. So whether it's the fact that Saudi Arabia still produces 1/10 of the oil in the world, the fact that many of the world's terrorists happen to be living in the Middle East and getting trained in the Middle East. We saw with the refugee flows, what happened in Syria totally upended the politics of Europe. This will go on for some time, and I think potentially could get worse. I only have 2 rules about the Middle East. One is that the enemy of your enemy can still be your enemy, and the other is things have to get worse before they get even worse. And we have not necessarily bottomed out in the Middle East. I think in the short run, there's questions not just of the misery in certain countries, which are essentially failed states, but I think the war in Yemen has the potential to get worse. I think the possibility of Iranian Saudi direct clashes cannot be ruled out. Questions about Saudi Arabian stability itself cannot be ruled out. And then in delayed ways, the nuclear agreement signed 2 years ago with Iran, it didn't resolve the problem, it parked it. And at some point, the limits in that agreement will expire. And I think questions about Iran's nuclear capabilities then and what it plans to do with them will come to the fore. And as we're likely to see this week, it's highly, highly unlikely that Iranian politics will work out in a way that we won't worry about their capabilities because we cease to worry about their intentions. I don't think Iran is, the politics of Iran are going to turn it into a Middle Eastern Switzerland any day soon. So Middle East will remain complicated for, I think, the foreseeable future and probably after that. Europe has gone from, in some ways, the most stable, predictable part of the world to something less than that. You've obviously had the return of geopolitics with what the Russians have done in Ukraine. You have the uncertainty caused by the rise of populists and nationalists. You got the specifics of Brexit. You've got the looming issue of Italy. I think we've had something of a respite with the Dutch vote and more significantly the French vote. But the real question with respites is whether people take advantage of them or not, whether they use them in the best sense of the word to introduce the kinds of reforms that are needed, or if not, then I think the forces of populism and nationalism return with a vengeance. So I think President Macron, Chancellor Merkel, and others have an opportunity. The real question is whether they are able to seize it. Asia, let me just talk about three things very quickly that keep me up a bit. One is the whole question of China's rise. And I would just simply say it's a reality. I don't think, however, it continues to be linear. I think there are interesting questions about China's future, its ability to manage its own trajectory. There's lots of people who are worried about China. I am less so on that. I think China is highly integrated into the region and the global economy, though again, there's still questions about how it uses its growing power, particularly against the backdrop of lower rates of economic growth. The more immediate problem, though, is North Korea. We can talk about that in a few minutes if you want. But we are fast approaching a point where North Korea can miniaturize nuclear weapons and put them on missiles that can reach the continental United States. They've already reached the point where North Korea can put weapons on missiles that can reach Japan, obviously South Korea, other parts of Asia. And the real question about is, are we in the world prepared to live with this? If not, can diplomacy contend with it successfully? If not, are we prepared to use military force? And if so, what would be the consequences of that? I would think in terms of people who are thinking about what implications the political world could have for the economic world over the next couple of years, this has got to be issue number one. The other thing I just mentioned in Asia, because it doesn't get enough attention, is India, Pakistan. Maybe because South Asia is on the other parts of the world for people who live in this country. But I just see that as a continuing uncertainty. To put it one way, at the height of the Cold War, the US-Soviet relationship was far more developed, had far more to it than the India-Pakistan relationship has now. And these are two nuclear-armed countries with a history of war between them and several running low-level conflicts now. And I would just think that if there were to be a significant terrorist attempt or attack emanating from Pakistan that caused a loss of life in India, I don't assume that things would simply stop there. So the potential there for serious escalation is significant. Between them, you're talking about, what, 1.5 billion people? So again, I just point that out because it doesn't get the attention it deserves. Happy to speak at length about Latin America and Africa. The good news is neither one has a lot of geopolitics. You know, I worry about a lot of things in the world. I don't worry about Argentina invading Brazil. I don't worry about Chile developing nuclear weapons. And that's good. I mean, the absence of geopolitics in the traditional sense is good. But both continents have all sorts of problems stemming from governance and economic issues. The most acute in Latin America is the failing, imploding country of Venezuela. And I think the real question is, can outsiders use various pressures to accelerate the fall of the government there in a peaceful way? And there's several places in Africa where obviously self-rule is not working, places like the South Sudan, the Congo, and so forth. And I would just think in lots of these places, there's issues about whether we need to rethink some of our ideas about foreign policy, because that might be a requirement for some sort of temporary types of interventions where outsiders help stabilize countries that can't quite put things together. And then after a transitional period, what the UN, around the time it was founded, called trusteeships, would then relaunch them. And I just think the need to think creatively about relaunching several countries is going to be on the agenda soon. The other thing, though, I wanted to talk about, besides going around the world very quickly in a geographical sense, is at the global level and how to think about that. And when I began, I talked quite a bit about the gap at the global level between the challenges and the responses. I think that is still the case. There aren't a lot of norms that are uniformly or broadly accepted. And in many cases, just the opposite. Take one we've seen in the last 72, 96 hours, which is cyber. You know, here we have these new technologies. We're connected, but there's virtually no rules that are widely accepted as to how how the conduct ought to be regulated on the internet in cyberspace. And to the extent there are rules, there's no real enforcement mechanism. So at the moment, there's no clear definition of permissible activity. What are countries allowed to do in peacetime? What is permissible? What would constitute an act of war? What is permissible in the way of espionage? How does one deal with privacy versus data? It's a long, long list of issues. And I would think one of the real challenges, I see where Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft the other day, talked about having a Geneva Convention for cyberspace. I've talked about a World Order 2.0, but the idea of coming up with rules of the road for how we would, again, regulate or structure this new terrain, this new domain. The only parallel thing I can think of is nuclear weapons when they came on the world scene in the 40s and 50s. And the intellectual literature of deterrence grew up, arms control as a field of diplomacy grew up. What's so interesting about the challenge now with cyber is it's orders of magnitude more difficult. Far more actors, many of whom are not states, much more quick-changing technology. And unlike nuclear, the role of the internet is far more integral to day-to-day economic life. So figuring out how we protect the advantages of the internet for commerce, the free flow of ideas, to operate our economies and so forth, yet somehow make sure that it's not disrupted. Getting that right, I think, will be extraordinarily difficult and, if you will, an open-ended challenge as the technology continues to evolve. I think there's been progress in some other areas, work against the spread of nuclear materials, work against terrorism, and so forth. With nuclear, I would just say, to come back to North Korea, the world does pretty well at trying to prevent countries from going nuclear. Quite a lot of effort, say, put into Iran. There's virtually no consensus in the world of what to do once a country crosses the barrier. Several countries have: Israel, India, Pakistan, North Korea. Iran is close. There's virtually no rules in effect for what happens then. And part of the struggle with North Korea is what to do about it. And there's simply no consensus and no clear path for dealing with it. With disease, the possibility of infectious disease is great. We saw it in recent years with things like Ebola and Zika. We could face it with influenza in the future. The question there is, how do we get, it's not so much international machinery, how do you get governments to take the steps they ought to take to prevent outbreaks, to monitor them if they happen, to deal with them? And in some cases, it's a lack of capacity. They don't have the equivalent of a Centers for Disease Control. In some cases, it's a lack of will, because they're worried that if it becomes clear that there has been a disease outbreak, it'll discourage tourism or business. So how do we get countries to act in a more responsible way when what happens within their borders is not simply a threat to them, but it's a threat to all of us, given globalization. Climate is another area. It's now been, what, year and a half, give or take, since the Paris Agreement was signed. Even if this agreement were lived up to in full, in no means would it come close to solving the problem. It would fall short, even if all of its goals were met, and it would fall short by a large amount. The likelihood is its goals will not be met, in part because the goals are so vague, in part because certain countries haven't signed up to them. China, for example, has agreed to have a peak of its emissions in the year 2030, but it's never specified what that would be. India hasn't even gotten that far. And for a country like India, with 1.3 billion people growing at 7%, if it's not prepared to sign up to something specific and meaningful there, you can understand the consequences. My own guess is in climate that all these efforts at mitigation and even adaptation ultimately don't work. And I would bet that when you're having this conference in 10 or 20 or 30 years, that one of the big issues on the agenda will be geoengineering. Basically various sort of high-tech Star Wars way questions about whether there are things that can be done, such as putting certain types of particles or what have you into the atmosphere in order to reflect the sun's light, whether there's things that can be done to basically reverse climate change. And the question is, who would do it? How would it be done? How could we be confident that if we were to do it on a large scale, it would have the desired effect? And who would decide whether it's done? What's the mechanism for deciding who's in charge? And I would just think that is going to be a growing debate. I could give you 10 other examples of places where the challenges are significant. I would just say, I just want to talk about two specific. One is trade, and it's been a rough time for the global trading system. And the failure of, the American decision to pull out of TPP, I think, is significant. Whether there'll be a TPP of 11, I don't know, or some subset. I would hope so, but I think that's a question to be resolved. I think it's good news in principle that the NAFTA pact has survived. The real question is what comes next. The dispute resolution mechanism of the WTO is remaining intact, but what we are probably not seeing are large new trade agreements. Global trade agreements seem to be dead in terms of negotiating them. And I think the real challenge for trade agreements in the future is what do they cover? How do they deal with issues like currencies? How do we somehow balance the national need to adjust currencies to moderate or to regulate the speed an economy grows, with the fact that those same actions can affect trading realities? And how do we deal with that? I think there'll also be questions of subsidies and government interventions in economies, but I think this is going to have to be on the trade agenda in the future. I would just think that also in this country and in others, there's been mainly you see it in Europe, you see it in the United States, real concerns about immigration, concerns about trade. My own view is in many cases these concerns are overblown or misplaced, that there's been a scapegoating of trade and immigration policies, which to some extent explains the increase in populism and nationalism. But these are the challenges that have brought this about are not disappearing. And what I mentioned in Europe as a respite with Mr. Macron's victory, I think is probably a broader point. That if the real source of job loss in the developed economies is much more technology and innovation, when I look at the next 10 to 20 years, that challenge is only going to get larger. And whether we're talking about autonomous vehicles, robotics, artificial intelligence, what have you, the forces of job elimination are going to pick up pace. And even though those same technologies will also create new jobs, there's going to be significant gaps between the skill sets that are the new jobs demand and the skill sets in the workforce. And one of the ongoing challenges for this country and for others is going to be training and education programs to help people reposition themselves so they can meet the requirements of emerging jobs. So it's going to mean recasting educational and training systems so they're truly lifelong. It's going to mean societies that have different kinds of safety nets in terms of paying for the education and retraining, and also tiding people over inevitable periods, multiple periods of unemployment in the course of their lives. I think more immediately, to be narrow about the United States, it makes strong arguments for things like corporate tax reform, repatriation of corporate profits, infrastructure spending, all of which will increase investment and jobs. The question is whether our politics are up to it. So I just think that there's real questions, but I don't think any society right now, not just the United States, I do not know of any society that is essentially prepared for the pressure of job elimination stemming from technology. And if we think we've had a run-in with populism and nationalism now, I don't think we've seen anything. So again, getting ready for that or heading it off, I would think is going to be one of the real challenges if we're not going to see a massive but probably misguided pushback against globalization and internationalism more broadly. I think special responsibilities fall on the United States, given that it plays an outsized role in the world. And I'm hoping that Americans come to see that, again, nothing stays local for long, and international involvement, rather than a distraction away from things domestic, rather than a diversion of effort, is actually tied to it. That this country can't succeed and thrive at home if there's instability abroad. But we are not there yet. I think making that connection is something that needs to be done, but I don't think a lot of people here get it. I also don't think it's clear in the rest of the world. I think that, again, there's a gap between the kind of level of effort and direction of effort that's needed to deal with global challenges and what most countries are prepared to do. China, for the most part, has not been willing to do many things, saying it's a developing country and can't be expected to do certain things. I find that explanation gets thinner and thinner. European countries have been quite preoccupied. Some other countries are legitimately simply focused domestically because their internal problems are so large and their resources are relatively modest. But unless there is a greater global effort to deal not just with, again, local problems, but these global problems of managing trade, managing climate, dealing with terrorism, dealing with proliferation, dealing with cyber and the rest, it becomes a much more problematic future. That's sort of where we are. We're not even 2 decades into the 21st century, but it's been a disappointing start. When I look at the last 25 years, what's so interesting about this era of history is what has not been here is the principal driver of a lot of the problems of history. And by that I mean, so much of the last few hundred years of history are about great power conflict. So you would have thought, as a first approximation, that the absence of great power conflict would probably mean that things would be pretty good. But I think what we're seeing when we look back over the last 25 years is that despite the absence of great power conflict, things are not that great. And many of the arrows are going in the wrong direction. So what that says to me is, one, we better really hope that great power conflict doesn't return or revive. And that puts a great emphasis on managing things like the US-China relationship or dealing with Russia. But secondly, even more, it says to me, we had better think about, as citizens, governments, as a world, about how we do deal with the global challenges that are increasingly the driver for what history will turn out to be. So let me stop there. There's too much talent in the room. I know this is the city of filibusters, but I will show uncharacteristic restraint and not do that, and just open it up to anything either I've put out there on the table or have not. The good news is that there's no shortage of stuff going on in the world. The bad news is there's no shortage of stuff going on in the world. I can vaguely see a hand over there through the lights. But do you have microphones? How does this work? Great. I think I saw a hand over there somewhere too. Okay, you're next.
Thanks. Stephen Murphy from Calla Holdings. Turkey was absent on your list. And secondly, the perception of America from around the world. I was in Algeria yesterday, and my taxi driver was lamenting the fact that America was putting itself first, and it's the beacon of democracy in the world, and it's losing its leadership role.
Yep. Well, Turkey, it's a good day to talk about it. Mr. Erdogan is here in our nation's capital on this magnificent spring day. Look, Turkey is heading in the wrong direction. From an American point of view, I would describe Turkey as an ally but not a partner. It's increasingly illiberal. Indeed, it's gone beyond illiberal. It's downright authoritarian. At home, virtually all the checks and balances of the Turkish political system have been weakened or entirely removed. The last I saw, I could be out of date, there's more journalists imprisoned in Turkey than any other country in the world. I think the recent referendum was, shall we say, suspect. Businesses that show independence get heavily taxed. Journalists, as I said, get arrested. Officials and educators get removed from their positions. So Turkey's democracy is increasingly, it's a one-party country and a one-man party. So it's not a meaningful democracy anymore. Its foreign policy, not that many years ago, Turkish foreign policy was defined as no problems with any neighbor. Now, what Turkey's essentially managed to do is it has no neighbor with whom it doesn't have problems. And the United States and Turkey has some real issues in terms of how we deal with any areas that are liberated, that are currently controlled by groups like ISIS. We're just simply not on the same page. Europe and Turkey are not on the same page at all, given Turkey's political direction. The only thing I think that keeps the European-Turkish relationship somewhat contained is Turkey's in a pivotal position given the flow of refugees potentially into Europe and the flow of recruits into the Middle East in terms of terrorist groups. But we've come a long way since the idea of Turkish membership in Europe was a real prospect. I just see this as continuing to be an uneasy relationship at best. And I think Mr. Erdogan, under the new constitution, is going to be, he'll be in office for at least another decade or longer. So I just see no reason to think things will improve. At best, they remain uneasy. At worst, they get a lot worse than that. Mr. Erdogan will succeed at being the second great man in contemporary Turkish history after Ataturk. Unfortunately, my own view is that, for what it's worth, he's taking Turkey in exactly the wrong direction. The second question was about, United States, America first. Yeah. Look, I think America first is an unfortunate formulation. It's very inconsistent with what I was talking about here, about the need for the United States to partner with others to deal with global challenges. It seems inconsistent with that, but I think it sends two very counterproductive messages. One is to our friends and allies. If it's America first, where does that leave them? Second? Third? I don't know. But allies, by definition, and friends are people who have taken their security and rather than being self-sufficient, or they have put it in our hands. But if they no longer have confidence in our hands, if they no longer see our hands as safe or steady, they're more likely to take matters into their own hands. And that could mean deferring to a more powerful neighbor, a China, a Russia, and Iran, what have you. It could also mean proliferating weapons. So either one, it seems to me, is a world of diminished stability, diminished American influence. So I don't like America first from how others see it. I also don't like how Americans see it because it reinforces what I think is the simply incorrect view that what we do abroad comes at the expense of what we do at home. And my whole argument is that what we do abroad is not an act of philanthropy, but the United States benefits directly from a stable world. And by the way, to the extent we have flaws at home, I don't think it's because of what we've done abroad. Our spending on defense is only about half the Cold War average as a percentage of GDP. And you can blame, say, the Iraq War on lots of stuff. You can blame it for a lot. I don't think you can blame the Iraq War, say, for the 2007 financial crisis. So again, to set guns against butter just seems to me to be unfortunate, and I think America First does just that. And I think your taxi driver had another point also. which is often the most important thing you do in foreign policy, is not something people do at the State Department, but it's the example you set as an economy, as a political system, as a society. And so the American influence in the world is to some extent directly tied to America's performance and what it is we look like to the rest of the world. And when our economy doesn't fare well, when our politics look dysfunctional, when our society doesn't look like it provides opportunity for lots of Americans, I think a lot of people around the world are no longer attracted to us or want to emulate us. And I think that's bad for us and bad for them. Sir. Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
I'm not in charge. I didn't pay, unlike the old Ronald Reagan, I didn't pay for the microphone, so I don't control it.
My name is Wei-Jo Su. I work with Stepstone. It's a global firm, but I'm based in Beijing. A question about North Korea. So you said that that's the #1 challenge, global challenge today. Many people feel there was another test last week. So many people feel this can't go on forever. On the one extreme, there'll be some military action. On the other extreme, that might be a meeting of the two guys, as Mr. Trump suggested at one point. If you have to make a prediction, how kind of timeline can you make?
I'm not very good at predicting. I would think that there probably will be a diplomatic effort, and it could well be bilateral between the United States and North Korea. It would not be at the presidential level, be at the diplomatic level. I can outline a deal. I don't know if it would be acceptable to either side. And I think the real question is for China, whether it is prepared to place sufficient pressure on North Korea so North Korea sees the wisdom of the deal. China says it doesn't have much influence. It's simply not true. It does. Almost all of North Korea's goods go in and out through China. What's held China back historically is a fear that if they put too much pressure on North Korea, they'll bring North Korea down. And the last thing China wants, they don't want the instability there. They don't want to have refugee inflows. And more important, they don't want to bring an end to a divided peninsula. So China has the dilemma of how do they pressure North Korea just enough but not too much. Easier said than done. For the United States, we might, I think as part of any arms control or negotiated agreement, we would have to be willing, at least in the short run, to accept the reality of North Korea's nuclear capabilities. I don't think denuclearization is a realistic near-term goal. Would we be willing to do that? I don't know. So I think there's big questions for China. There's big questions for the United States. I think the election of South Korea's new president complicates life a little bit, since he appears to be less comfortable with putting real pressure on North Korea, much less with threatening or using military force. It's hard to predict North Korean behavior because it comes down so much to one individual. And again, I would simply, I think the biggest variable then is how much pressure China is willing to bring to bear. My own sense is China came away from the meeting in Mar-a-Lago understanding that it can't be business as usual, that the United States will look seriously at the option of military force if North Korea's capabilities are not to some extent capped. And by the way, I don't think this is just Donald Trump's policy. I think this would have been Hillary Clinton's policy. I think this is something that people on both sides of the partisan divide here would come together on. I think there's real discomfort with the idea of a North Korea that can directly threaten the United States. No one is comfortable with that. So again, I think the Chinese understand that the kind of drift that has characterized the last 2+ decades can't continue. Whether they are prepared, therefore, to do things very differently, I don't know. And what effect that would have on North Korea, I don't know. But I think we're likely to see against the backdrop of greater sanctions. I think we will see a diplomatic effort. One more. There's been a gentleman right there who's been very patient. Yes, sir. Well, you don't have a microphone. You can shout, or you can wait for a microphone.
Hi, Jake Ho from the Lightsmith Group. It's a great case to be made for the forces of entropy in the world. I'm wondering, there's alternate structures that are being created, the Asian Infrastructure Bank, the One Belt One Road. You still have Merkel in power, you have Macron, you have Canada. There are forces of civilization that still exist. Can you make a bull case for a return to a world of more order or different order, and then do you believe it?
Very funny. Well, Nick Rowan and I were talking beforehand, and this gets a little bit his question, so I promised I wouldn't end on a downer. So I'll answer your question and his and together. Look, I think there's positive things going on out there. I think the lack of geopolitics in places like Latin America and Africa is a positive thing. The fact that more of Latin America seems to be moving away from populism than towards it is a good thing. India growing at 7% is a good thing. Asia collectively, put aside North Korea for a moment, but the fact that it's had the economic growth it's had without conflict for as long as it's had is truly, truly impressive. The global trading system is still intact, even if it's not particularly advancing, but people are using the WTO. Trade continues to modestly grow. For the first time in I don't know how many years, the IMF numbers will be adjusted upward rather than downward. The agreement on climate at least happened. It creates a framework. It sets the possibility of some greater progress. I think there is a degree of international consensus against terrorism. Yeah, so I think there's positive things. I think Europe, compared to the conversation we would have had the French election gone differently a Sunday ago, the fact that Merkel and Macron are talking about EU reform and the European project is intact and indeed may change in ways that it becomes more significant is an extraordinarily positive thing. So, I think all that's true. I think, just offsetting it, though, are some real concerns. I mean, look, if I were an optimist, I'd have to quit. I have a structural conflict of interest here. But, no, but seriously, I do think that if you looked at the last 25 years, if there was a share of stock called State of the World, Inc., it would have lost value. I don't know if it would have been a correction or something worse, but it would have lost value. So that's a fact. And the recent trends have been that way. So the idea that it's somehow just going to fix itself and get better, no. The kind of initiatives you're mentioning with China are mixed blessings, shall we say. In terms of the geopolitical dimension of them, it's not clear it's going to be a race to the top in terms of certain types of rules that would regulate or govern trade and so forth. So, yeah, I'm more concerned than not. So I don't think it's one-dimensional. And like I said before, at any one point in history, you've got elements, again, what my friend Hedley Bull called society, and elements of anarchy, or elements of order, elements of disorder, or disarray. It's never black or white. It's always a mixture of the two. But I am worried about some of the trends in my own country's foreign policy. I am worried that Russia is increasingly a country that seems to be pursuing a foreign policy that is quite disruptive, to say the least. I don't have a crystal ball. I can't quite predict China's internal trajectory, but I think China faces some speed bumps at some point. I think the world is having real problems coping with the threat of cyber, or the uses of cyber in ways that are threatening. Maybe the last few days will be a wake-up call. The world is having real trouble dealing with a category of crises that I would classify as slow-motion crises, like climate change, where you don't have the inherent urgency to galvanize a response, so things keep getting worse. And by the time the world wakes up to it, the moments for easy involvement, shall we say, will have come and gone. I don't rule out the possibility for a return of significant great power or major power rivalry, or worse, you've got demographic challenges and so forth. Now, again, nothing's deterministic, and that's sort of my basic point. And a lot of the technologies will come on the scenes, will have upsides as well as as well as downsides. But I guess my point is simply, in using, someone used the word here of entropy, the natural tendency is one towards diffusion, entropy, slight disorder. Things just don't fix themselves. This is not some finely self-honed, self-regulated machine. There's no invisible hand a la Adam Smith that regulates the world as a geopolitical reality. It takes visible hands, in this case of the United States and other countries, that are both like-minded and willing to do things. And the question is, are they sufficiently able and are they sufficiently willing to do those things? And I would simply say the jury's out. The good news is there's no reason to think that pessimism is the only way to go. I just can't rule it out. And that's, coming back to be self-centered for 30 seconds. The reason I wrote this book was in part is I wanted to drop that rock in the pond of the debate. That it just can't be left to itself. I wanted people to be actively involved in this country and around the world to try to shape history rather than be shaped by it. I am now getting the stop sign, and I've learned how to take messages, so I will stop. But thank you very much. Thank you.